as David says, I think most people here are familiar with the official version of Heinrich Himmler's death as it has been handed down to us from Allied sources. The story where he was able somehow to keep a vial of cyanide hidden in his mouth for 3 whole days without any of his interrogators ever being able to locate it. They looked everywhere else, according to the sources I've accessed, but they could never seem to lay their finger on it. We're also familiar, I think, with their claims of how they valiantly tried to save his life after he bit into the capsule and made every effort to bring him back and resuscitate him, only to fail. Well, it's a nice little story as far as stories go. But what I've been able to find out after 15 years of research tends to lead me to another conclusion. It's a well-known fact that prominent SS leaders were being assassinated directly after the war, from 1945 through 1948. These assassinations were carried out by different organizations on behalf of different individuals. One organization was DIN, that was composed of Jews who had been partisans and who had survived the dissolution of the Eastern European ghettos. They embarked upon a campaign of assassination of SS leaders. They have claimed to have assassinated some 200 SS officials from the years 1945 to 1948. Now, according to the March-April issue of the Barnes Review, they quote a man named Peter Mason, which is a rather unusual case as well. Peter Mason was an English Jew who claimed to have been commissioned by none other than Winston Churchill in a special squad to go about assassinating German officials after the war. Whether this is true or not, I don't know, but I know that his book has now been published and he's revealing more and more details, but he won't reveal the names of his commanders. And this brings us to Field Marshal Montgomery, because it was his men, his interrogators, his units, which were responsible for the capture and interrogation of Himmler. Now, the records tell us, as Mr. Irving pointed out, that there are no records of an interrogation of Heinrich Himmler at the hand of his interrogators in 1945. However, in reading the memoirs of Field Marshal Montgomery, I happened to discover this little statement. Montgomery wrote, "The arrest and interrogation of Himmler is of interest." Well, he says that he was interrogated. Now here is a message which they decoded at the time. On April 28th, just a couple of weeks before Himmler's capture and death, the day after the Allies rejected Himmler's peace offer, Himmler himself had sent a message to SS General Bellinger to collect together all the SS forces in the South. Bellinger's reply, decrypted on the 1st of May, stated that the disintegration taking place was on a scale reminiscent of 1918, and insisted on the need to concentrate all German forces in the South under one command. It was followed by yet another message from Himmler, decrypted on the 2nd of May. This pleaded with Bellinger to collect the SS units militarily under your command and head them yourself. And here's what Himmler wrote, which I think is particularly interesting. He wrote, "Defend the entrance to the Alps for me." Now, there was a lot of talk at the time. The companions who were captured with Himmler, Grothmann and Macher, and Leon de Grelle, who happened to meet Himmler at the time as well, all have written reports about Himmler's talking about some secret mission which he had to undertake at the time. So it's quite clear by these reports, Himmler had no intention of committing suicide. Curiously, though, I have to remark that it was quite a sight, I imagine, when Himmler, Grothmann, and Macher were walking down a street in Bremervörde, and just prior to their arrest. Grothmann and Macher were walking ahead of the Reichsfuhrer. They were wearing big, heavy rubber trench coats, And Macher, of course, who was a war hero, was limping. But behind them was trudging Himmler, and he was barely making it. I mean, and he was dressed very shabbily. They had an odd collection of civilian garments covered by a blue rain jacket. They must have looked an odd sight indeed, for the two men were walking ahead of the older one, and they kept looking back to make sure he hadn't fallen or disappeared somehow. Anyway, it was only a short matter of time before they fell into a trap that had been set for them by the British authorities, who had been scouring the area for 3 men for a full 24 hours. Well, they could have hardly missed them, right? They weren't hiding. They didn't capture Himmler hiding behind a rock or in a barn, or they were walking right in full view, right in the street. Admittedly, Himmler had the patch on and he had the clothes, but I don't find this peculiar at all. The man was trying to get to southern Germany in one piece for whatever he thought his mission was at the time. At any rate, the patrol stopped him, took him into custody. They were brought into a Sergeant Haag. He was sent from this point to a camp known as Westertimke, where Allied POWs had been kept, and now German POWs were being placed there. This was so-called the 031 Civil Interrogation Camp in the vicinity of Barnstedt, just south of Lüneburg. Himmler had been going by the name Sergeant Hitzinger, and his companions were officially booked at 6:30 p.m. on May 23rd, 1945. Himmler had 4 hours left to live. Now, these hours are crucial. Himmler was now going to be searched for the second time. The first time he was searched was with Macher and Grothmann by Sergeant Haag. This time he was going to get a more thorough search, a much more thorough search. Sylvester writes, "This I carried out personally, handling each item of clothing as it was removed to my sergeant, who re-examined it. In his jacket, I found a small brass case similar to a cartridge case, which contained a small glass vial. I recognized it for what it was, but asked Himmler what it contained. And he said, 'That is my medicine. It cures stomach cramp.'" Well, so here you have a statement. They found one brass cartridge that was supposedly contained a vial of cyanide. Of course, they never tested it to make sure it was cyanide. That was never done. The other was just an empty case. I've been trying to figure out why Himmler would have left an empty case there. I mean, if he was trying to conceal the fact that he had cyanide on him, why would he leave the empty case in his pocket to lead to that very suspicion? So that's suspicious to me. He said, Sylvester says, "I found a similar brass case without the vial, and came to the conclusion that the vial was hidden somewhere on the prisoner's person. When all Himmler's clothing had been removed and searched, all the orifices of his body were searched. Also his hair combed, and any likely hiding place examined, but no trace of the vial was found. But at this stage, he was not asked to open his mouth. But he just said, 'I searched every orifice of his body.' But at this stage, he wasn't asked to open his mouth. Colonel Michael Murphy, Chief of Intelligence of the British Army, under Field Marshal Montgomery, arrived on the scene. And I will tell you that things changed from this point on for Himmler. This time, for the third time, Himmler was strip searched amidst very rough handling and physical abuse, verbal abuse. Chaim Herzog, when he was interviewed by Peter Padfield, briefly described what he saw and heard that night. Here's what he said. Colonel Murphy arrived at about 8 that evening. Keep that in mind, people. Musmano verified it in 1945. Murphy arrived at 8 that evening and had Himmler taken out unceremoniously in a blanket and bundled into his car. According to Herzog, Murphy was using all forms of epithets, including, "Come on, you bastard, we'll teach you." They'll teach him what? Do you know that's the established story? Murphy arrived at 9:45. They took a 7-mile drive over to the Special Interrogation Center, and within 15 minutes, Himmler committed suicide. Here Himmler was kept in custody for over 2 days. He takes a 7-mile ride at 9:45, and he's dead in 15 minutes? No. Murphy left with Himmler at 8 o'clock. Thus, there's a 3-hour lapse between the time Himmler was taken from Sylvester's custody to when he was alleged to have committed suicide 3 hours later. What went on during those 3 hours? In any event, Himmler had arrived in an escort of 3 vehicles when he got there. The first person to exit the vehicle was Colonel Murphy, followed by the stooped and bent-over figure of the former Reichsfuhrer SS, ignominiously dressed only in a nightshirt and wrapped about with a woolen blanket, conjuring up a Christ-like image presented before Herod just prior to crucifixion. It was a pathetic sight. Himmler just clad in a blanket and all stooped and hunched over. Well, apparently Himmler, at this point, was searched again. Now keep in mind, he's undergone 5 complete searches, every orifice, but of course they never think to look in his mouth, they never think to ask, you know. That's always avoided. Always. Well, according to Padfield, when Himmler allegedly bit into the cyanide capsule, he was jumped by Austin and Murphy, who upended him on the floor, held his feet high, while Wells gripped his throat. Now, I've seen many photographs of Himmler's body. Much different. Different angles, different shots. I've seen what appears to be blood on his head. I've seen what appears to be ligature marks around his neck, a bruise along the side of his face. You never see the back of Himmler's head either. And I challenge anybody to dig up as many pictures as you can of Himmler's body. You will not see any of the back of his head either. I can very well believe that Himmler was jumped by Austin and Murphy and that someone was strangling him. But not in order to save his life, for God's sake. At any rate, Himmler died. That much we know for certain. And now we're going to get to the autopsy. Well, we all know why autopsies are conducted, right, people? They're conducted to determine the cause of death, right? Guess what? I've got his autopsy report. There's not one word in here that gives the cause of death. Not one. There's plenty about his anus and his sexual organs and their condition, but there's nothing about his cause of death. Not one test was conducted to determine the cause of death. And it's right here. You know, it's claimed that Himmler died as a result of cyanide. Yet numerous photos taken of Himmler at the time, we've seen them. There are no signs of cyanosis present. How do I know this? Because I've studied it. I like to read. I located a book on forensic medicine called Homicide Investigation. And here's what they say. Cyanide, whether taken internally or inhaled in the form of a gas, kills a person by interfering with the body's utilization of oxygen carried by the blood. Consequently, death is a form of asphyxia. In addition, when alkali cyanides are taken internally, there are evidences of corrosion of the lips, tongue, throat, and stomach. In cases of acute poisoning, the symptoms which develop very rapidly are chiefly dizziness, palpitation, intense air hunger, cyanosis, i.e., a very dark blue color of the skin, and unconsciousness. Violent convulsions may develop. The hands are usually clenched. Death nearly always takes place very rapidly. However, if there happens to have been food in the stomach at the time the cyanide was taken, these symptoms may be considerably delayed. Delayed, people. They'll still be present. They'll just be delayed. But here's the external appearance of a person who dies from ingestion of cyanide. Externally, now you've seen Himmler's corpse for yourselves. The most characteristic features are the open, staring eyes with dilated pupil, frothing at the mouth, bright red or purple patches on various parts of the body. Did any of you see that? I didn't. But you know what? Hermann Goering's corpse has those features. Perhaps many of you here have seen the photo taken of the Reich Marshal after his suicide by cyanide. I recall that one author, obviously uninformed as to the appearance of a corpse poisoned by cyanide, remarked that Goering's half-opened eyelids reminded him of winking. But that is one of the classic symptoms of cyanide poisoning, that half-open eyelid. Himmler didn't have it, did he? Himmler's fists weren't clenched. Well, the way I think Himmler died, I'm going to tell you. I think that he was beaten, and he was beaten so hard and so viciously about the head that it caused a rupture inside of his head. And that led to his death. And one final thing. The person who performed the autopsy excised Himmler's brain and portions of his skull. This is a fact. We don't know what happened to it, but I'll tell you something. I have a good idea how Himmler died, and I hope you all do today as well. Thank you, Len, for all your patience.
I'm living in Hollywood. I'm a writer, and I have a meeting at Paramount. And the secretary there, she's reading something that I wrote about the Billionaire Boys Club. And she tells me, I like it. It reminds me of my family. I say, the Billionaire Boys Club? Your family? And the secretary says, yes, all those murders. My mother, Lola, was at Auschwitz. I say, oh. Secretary says, and after that, my mother commanded a prison full of Nazis. I say, what? A few days later, Hollywood, the Moustache Cafe, spinach crepe. I'm having spinach crepe. I'm having dinner with Lola. Elegant woman, coral lipstick, black eyeliner that goes like this, you know, like on a femme fatale. She speaks 5 languages fluently. She's 66 years old. And Lola starts telling me her story. She tells me that at the end of World War II, she commanded a prison in Gleiwitz, Germany. She says the inmates were German soldiers, but she says some were Nazis, even SS, pretending to be German soldiers. Now, it's 1989. Poland is still communist, but I get into Lola's prison, into the prisoner's cell. I tell them, Dzień dobry, good morning, I'm visiting. I see the prison records. Remember when, according to Lola, she went to the Polish government and said, I want revenge, okay. I find Lola's application in Lola's own handwriting. She writes, I want to cooperate against our German oppressors. I find the official document appointing her commandant in Gleiwitz. And after that, I go to Germany 11 more times, to Poland 3 more times, to France, Austria, Italy, Canada, all around the United States. I talked to 200 people with interpreters, in Polish and Russian, Danish and Swedish, German and Dutch, French and Spanish, Yiddish and Hebrew. I left out English. I get 300 hours of tape-recorded interviews, and I see thousands of documents. And what do I learn? Well, Lola was telling the truth. She was the commandant in Gleiwitz, and she was taking revenge. She slapped the Germans around. And just as she said, she stopped. I remember one day in 1989, I was having lunch with one of her guards at the Hotel Lejny, reading Wiener Schnitzel, and out of the blue the man says, you know, Lola stopped. She told us stop. She said, we're going to show the Germans we're not like them. So Lola was telling the truth, but she wasn't telling the whole truth. Lola had told me the people in her prison were German soldiers, and yeah, 20 of them were. They were German soldiers working as painters, as carpenters. But there were 1,000 other prisoners there, and they were German civilians, German men, German women, German children. One prisoner was a 14-year-old boy. He had been out in Gleiwitz wearing his Boy Scout pants. Someone cried out, "You're wearing black pants, you're a fascist," and the man chased the boy and tackled him at the Church of St. Peter and Paul and took him to Lola's prison. The boy was completely innocent. So were most of the people in Lola's prison. They weren't Gestapo, they weren't SS, they weren't even Nazis. Of 1,000 prisoners in Lola's prison, 20, just 20, were ever even accused of it. But the Germans in Lola's prison were slapped and whipped. And I'm sorry to have to say it, but they were tortured. The Boy Scout, the guards poured gasoline on his curly black hair and set it on fire. The boy went insane. The men, they were beaten with a Totschläger, a beater to death. It's a long steel spring, and at the end there's a big lead ball, and you use it like a racquetball racket. Your arm, your wrist, and the spring, they deliver a triple hit to a German's face. Now, Lola didn't tell me, but the Germans in her prison were dying. I found their death certificates in Gleiwitz City Hall. One of Lola's guards told me, yeah, the Germans would die. He told me I'd put the bodies on a horse-drawn cart. I'd cover them with potato peels so no one would see. I'd ride to the outskirts, and after I threw the potato peels out, I'd take the Germans to the Catholic cemetery to the mass grave. We all know about Auschwitz, but I have to tell you, the Germans in Lola's prison were worse off than Lola was at Auschwitz. Lola at Auschwitz wasn't locked up in a room night and day. She wasn't tortured night after night. She herself had told me, thank God, nobody tried to rape us. The Germans weren't allowed to. But all of that happened to German girls at Lola's prison in Gleiwitz. Now, the Office of State Security was a Polish government organization. The lower ranks were Polish Catholics, but most of the leaders were Polish Jews. The chief of the office in Warsaw was a Jew. When I was in Poland, he wasn't alive, but I met some of his family. The department directors, or almost all of them, were Jews. In the province where Lola was, Silesia, in Silesia, the director of the Office of State Security was a Jew. I met him in Copenhagen, a little bald-headed man. Didn't know that I'd be a little bald-headed man 10 years later. The director of prisons was a Jew. I met his whole family. The Secretary of State Security was a Jew. I met him time and again at his home in New Jersey. And in Silesia in 1945, 3/4 of the officers, now not the GIs, not the guards, but the lieutenants, the captains, the officers, 1/4 of them were Catholics and 3/4 were Jews. I interviewed 24. And I learned that the Office of State Security ran 227 prisons like Lola's, prisons for German civilians. This one camp, I found the death certificates for 1,583 Germans. In other camps, other prisons, thousands of German civilians died. German men, women, children, babies. At one camp, there was a barracks for 50 babies. They were in cribs, but the camp doctor, he was a Jew, he was from Auschwitz, Dr. Sidorowski, he didn't heat the barracks, he didn't give the babies milk, he gave them soup, and 48 of the 50 babies died. All in all, 60,000 to 80,000 Germans died. Now, some were killed by Jews, some by Catholics, many by typhus, dysentery, starvation, but all 60,000 to 80,000 died in the custody of the Office of State Security. And it all had been covered up for almost 50 years. Jews who did it didn't talk about it. For example, the chief of police in Breslau, Germany, in 1945 was a Jew. He wrote a book about the Holocaust, and at the end of the book he says, what he says about being chief of police in Breslau is, quote, "We move westward to Breslau and from there to Prague." That's it. Jewish reporters who knew about it didn't write about it. There's a working reporter right now in New York City. He was in Poland right after World War II. He tells me, whatever the Germans tell you, believe me, it's true. But he himself never wrote about it. The truth was covered up and was still being covered up. In 1989, I go to Jerusalem to Yad Vashem. Now, as you know, they have 50 million documents there about the Holocaust. And I asked them, well, what do you have on the Office of State Security? They have nothing. I asked, well, what do you have about Jews in the Office of State Security? Nothing. I say, well, there were Jewish commandants, Jewish directors, and they say, the chairman of Yad Vashem says it sounds rather imaginary, and the director of archives says to me, impossible, impossible, denial, denial. That's what the Jews in the Office of State Security have taught us. That's what I tried to write, what I did write in An Eye for an Eye. The very first words of the dedication for all who died and for all who, because of this story, might live.
Ladies and gentlemen, I'd now like to move right into my reason for being here tonight. I'd like to make a contribution to our understanding of what really happened and why, courtesy of Professor Christopher Browning. For example, on Mr. Irving's website can be found an article written by Robert Race. It's a review of The Path to Genocide, published in 1995. Race demonstrated that Browning has not presented any documentary evidence for his contention that there was a German government policy specifically enacting what Browning and others referred to as the final solution to the Jewish question in the sense of killing. This phrase, the final solution, appears in the titles of all four of Browning's books, but documentary reference to the phrase in the German documents is itself rather scarce. In the context of mass murder, it cannot be said to exist at all, with one exception, and that would be the Huss confession in Krakow, Poland in 1946. That was an interrogation, and I wouldn't put too much weight on that testimony. I'm sure you people are aware with the interrogations of Rudolf Hess, the commandant of Auschwitz. At any rate, there's nothing in the text of that book, which came out in 1995, nothing in the footnotes, nothing to confirm that this abstract entity existed, the final solution, as a killing program. The term Endlösung, final solution, did of course appear in 5 or 6 German government documents during the war. Certainly in 4 inter-office memoranda, as well as the Wannsee Conference Protocol of January 8, 1942. And I won't question the actual authenticity of any of these documents. I'll just look at their context and content and validate them, or pass judgment on them. The first is a letter from Heydrich to Ribbentrop dated June 24th, 1940. Secondly, there's the Goering Decree, it's called, of July 31st, 1941. The Wannsee Protocol of January 8th, 1942. And a directive written by Franz Rademacher of the German Foreign Office, Section D3, on February 10th, 1942. There's also the Schlegelberger Memorandum, which Mr. Irving spoke of yesterday, and I'm sure he'll mention that again throughout the course of this weekend. The first document is a suggestion that Ribbentrop participate in discussions on the Jewish question, and this one was dated 1940, specifically mentioning a territorial Endlösung, a territorial solution, which would have to be found And the meaning of this proposed territorial solution in 1940 is disclosed in the documents which follow, because they're all, one follows the other chronologically. Browning doesn't bother mentioning this memo in his writings. He does write this on page 15 of his book, Faithful Months. On page 15 of the book, we read that a policy of emigration had been encouraged by Hitler to 1941, and that, quote, in short, Nazi Jewish policy until 1941 does not support the thesis of a long-held fixed intention to murder the Jews of Europe, unquote. So that kind of cancels the supposed criminality of the 1940 document. Document number 2, which was Nuremberg document PS 710, the Goering Decree of 1941, was a supplement to the earlier directive of January 24, 1939, which discussed the solution of the Jewish question through emigration and expulsion. Heydrich, the head of the security service, had been further commissioned to show Goering the both organizational, factual, and material measures already taken for the intended final solution of the Jewish question. On page 21 of Fateful Months, Browning writes, the significance of this document is open to debate, and mentions the thesis of Martin Brojat that it was a comprehensive program for the deportation of the Jews to Russia. So he basically tells us himself that that isn't proof of the final solution as described as killing. In his Foreign Office study of 1978, which incidentally may have been commissioned as a response to Mr. Irving's 1977 book, having appeared alongside the Fleming book, Hitler and the Final Solution, Browning wrote that certainly in October, neither Luther nor Rudemacher of the Foreign Office had any idea that this new final solution meant the deportation of Jews from the various countries in Europe. Meant here is deportation to the east, let alone a plan to murder. And he writes that a week after Luther's meeting with Heydrich, and I quote, Luther was still thinking in terms of deporting Jews from Europe, which was in line with the underlying principles of the Madagascar plan, unquote. So there's nothing in the files which indicates a murderous plan. In his witness statement of 1999, Browning wrote, this was not an order for the final solution, and no comprehensive draft for a final solution is among the surviving German documents found after the war. I will presume that this statement applies to the Wannsee Protocol as well. On Wannsee, document 3, we read the following in Professor Browning's witness statement of this year. The evacuations were to be regarded solely as temporary measures, for practical experiences were already being gathered that would be of significance for the imminent final solution. Heydrich went on to explain just what he meant by this. The Jews would be utilized for labor in the East. He also writes that the protocol merely cryptically noted, finally there was a discussion of various types of possible solutions. On page 79 of Browning's 1978 book, he wrote that, once again with regard to Auschwitz, he wrote, quote, the evacuation to the east had now replaced emigration as a further solutional possibility, unquote, which confirms the change in policy which the previously mentioned documents hinted at. If we hold Professor Browning to his statement about no comprehensive draft for the final solution having survived the war, then we can assume that the Wannsee Protocol is not the blueprint for an overall plan to murder European Jewry that has been ascribed to it by the traditional historians. This despite his citation of Eichmann in 1978. Browning wrote that the solutional possibilities discussed at the conclusion of the conference were described by Eichmann in his interrogations as killing possibilities. He does not mention Eichmann's statement in 1999, and there's a reason for that, I think. Professor Browning wrote some embarrassing references to Eichmann in his 1978 study. I don't think he regards him as a credible witness these days. But more on Eichmann in a moment. The point is there's nothing in the documents themselves. Document 4, the Rademacher Memorandum to Bielefeld of the North African Colonial Department. He would have been concerned about the Madagascar solution that was discussed. Well, this document was written on February 10th, 1942, and it may be the key to the entire series of documents I mentioned, and it's the last time the final solution was mentioned in the documents. I'll quote Browning on this on page 79 of the Foreign Office book. The war with the Soviet Union had placed other territories at the disposal of the final solution. Therefore, the Führer has decided that the Jews should be deported not to Madagascar, but to the east. Madagascar thus no longer needs to be provided for the final solution. I say this is the key document because clearly the Madagascar plan had also been regarded as a final solution. It's right there in the text. And it's obvious that killing was never part of that plan. So there it is, an absence of a plan to murder, confirmation of a plan to deport to the east. And, of course, there's the Schlegelberg document as well. So there's no comprehensive proof of the implementation of the presumed Hitler order of a final solution in the traditional sense in the German government documents. In conclusion, I think my study of Christopher Browning is a very clear indication that the exterminationists can be seen to seek out documents which appear to confirm their thesis. Obvious forgeries, documents which support an opposite thesis, and ambiguous texts are the stuff of which this history is compiled. One can only conclude that the state of the evidence is good for revisionism. The evidence presented by Christopher Browning in his books, articles, and expert witness statements is also a windfall for revisionism. Thank you.